Great. Okay, so we are almost at the end. Super exciting. Tomorrow's going to be our last part. Today we will talk all about teamwork, task management, as we just mentioned. So by now you're super familiar with the computational action process. Today we're going to talk about part 4. Before I jump into today, which is about teamwork and task management, I want to highlight something really awesome that I got in a response from yesterday's section. A few of you had written in response, this is a lot of front-end design that we talked about yesterday. What about if you are doing something in the deep learning track or just in general? What about other product design or technical design? How are you supposed to think about design and prototyping when the focus isn't on front end? I think that's a great point. I do want to emphasize that yesterday we talked a lot about front end design because it's pretty relevant for a lot of you who are making apps. And the process of sketching and testing is a very visual process that hopefully is also very relevant to most teams. Another part of design is the feature design. What we mean by feature design is both product and technical. There's a lot more detailed about this too in the doc for lesson 4, which is part 4, which is today's doc. But as a high level, there's you can think about product feature design as basically really listing out and working together and agreeing on what the key details of your feature are going to be. So especially if you're thinking of using existing data sets or using pre-trained models, if you're in the deep learning track or making your own model, this would all go as part of your feature details because it's what you're building, right? And then the implementation design would be more technical. So oftentimes a product feature design and implementation design definitely reference each other because they go hand in hand. But you can think about implementation design as what are the technical details, right? So maybe what models are you going to use, or what specific data sets are you going to use, or what type of prediction threshold or accuracy threshold is going to be in the model. So, a lot of these technical components or technical details you can also design and definitely would be helpful to agree on in your team as you're making your projects. So I wanted to briefly touch on this, that design is definitely, there's a visual component of design, but there's also a feature component of design, which is literally writing out and agreeing upon and listing out the feature details, which may or may not have visual components. Does that make sense to everyone? For those of you who asked that question, that was a great question from yesterday's responses. Any thoughts, any questions on this? No, looks like we're feeling okay. Okay, so hopefully that was helpful. Definitely feel free to reach out if you have any more questions on feature design, especially product feature design. Definitely happy to chat. Cool. All right. So let's jump into today. Today, we're mostly going to take a lot of time for you to practice this in your teams. And I understand in the past days, maybe you were maybe not yet ready, for instance, yesterday to do sketching. So you talked more about problem finding. I really hope today that the breakout times for you to practice listing out tasks is still relevant, no matter where you are in your project. That's actually what we'll be talking about today. So hopefully you can make great use of today's time and start doing task management. Doesn't actually depend on where you are in your cycle. You could be in any part of the computational action process, and this is still hopefully going to be very relevant to you today. All right, so first, a brief introduction to organization. There are a lot of different organization principles, disciplines, and kind of general good organization heuristics that people, especially in the tech world, tend to use. You may have heard of these companies: Trello, Asana, Jira, and Confluence. They're all productivity and organization tools and companies, and in fact they're actually really massive. So Atlassian, which is an Australian company that owns Jira and Confluence, more recently in the last couple of years also bought Trello. So they're all similar products with slightly different strengths, slightly different kind of use cases and user interfaces, but they all help real engineers, project managers, product managers, designers, etc. They really are widely used in industry. If you've ever had an internship at a tech company, you probably are familiar with these tools or similar tools. And if you want to go into engineering or the tech industry in the future, you definitely will come across, if not these tools specifically, then a similar tool with the same type of concept. So before I talk about Agile, which we will talk about and I'll introduce the topic, I want to talk about something that I really love using called a Gantt chart, which you can see here on the screen. You might have basically already done something like this without maybe necessarily knowing it has a term to it called Gantt chart. But really all it is listing out like a to-do list. And then on the left hand side, and then on the top, listing out the timeline. And a Gantt chart is a really nice, very simple, but very visual way of representing the timeline of a project, or maybe the timeline of a to-do list. And you can apply this to projects easily. You can see here, a good way of applying it is to have different sections like planning, research, design, implementation, follow-up, which is very similar to all of the sections that we were talking about for your project. And on the top here, you can see in industry, oftentimes we talk about months and quarters and years. That's the general timeline usually for a lot of projects in companies. But of course, in this case, you have 2 weeks for the Create-a-thon. So a great way of making use of something like the Gantt chart is to have one column be each day and list out how long you think how long you hope each section will take, how many days it will take. It definitely can overlap, as you can see here. And as we've been doing a lot of these sections this week, you definitely have been overlapping planning and researching and design. But this is a great way because your deadline is going to be before next Friday, right? So you can work backwards and figure out how many days you can spend on each section and how to get everything, how to plan out everything from the deadline back so that you can get everything done in time. As a quick thing, usually implementation takes quite a while because, as you're all familiar, you have to code and debug and test. So oftentimes implementation will also overlap with design, and also you can expect it to take up, like many days in this case, or oftentimes in industry, many months. Any questions about Gantt chart? Cool. One cool thing about the Gantt chart that I really love is that you can see it's just a matrix. So you can set it up easily in just a spreadsheet, or you can make it visual. However, whatever works for you. You don't necessarily have to use a tool, because you just make a table and list out when you are expecting to do what sections. And you can obviously change the left side panel of tasks to be more specific to your project. Cool. So I really recommend you fill out a Gantt chart on a high level with your team. I think it's a great high level view of task management. Now we're going to talk about Agile, and I'm going to switch screens because I really like how Lisa Spark describes Agile. Has anyone heard of the term Agile or Agile methodology before? Cool, I see some nods. Can anyone share with me what they know about Agile, what it means to them? Any volunteers? No, we're feeling a little shy today. It's okay, it's the 4th day. I understand if everyone's a little tired. No one wants to share? I'm super curious to hear how you think of Agile. Does anyone know what the word Agile means? Because Agile is also a word. Yeah. So, yeah, Shmita, go ahead.
Well, Agile usually means swift. So Agile is just basically to make your it's like this way to make your software more efficient, like during development stages.
Yeah, that's a great answer. You got it exactly right. So Agile as a word usually means, a swift or fast, and Agile methodology is a practice that should help you, like Ashmita said, make your software development process faster and more organized. So the main key components of Agile is to have a few steps and iterate through the few steps and always be checking in. So this is why when you hear Agile being talked about, especially if you've had an internship or if you talk to engineers, they talk about Agile, but they also talk about it in steps of, it's a 1 week sprint process or a 2 week sprint process. What they mean when they say this is that they're checking in every 1 or 2 weeks and kind of going through the cycle of the process again in this time frame. So basically, in a nutshell, they're coding, they know where they're doing, they know what tasks they have to complete. And then at the end of either 1 or 2 weeks, they're always checking in with the team to get on the same page, and then the process starts over again. So that's why one of the key steps of the Agile process is what we call iteration. We've already talked about iteration in terms of the computational action process, because you are oftentimes repeating steps to improve your product. And so you're iterating through the process. So I really like how this website kind of lays out Agile terms and then Agile examples. And then we're going to talk about Scrum, because the Scrum framework is a very common, very popular way to apply the Agile methodology. Don't worry about remembering these terms. It's really just sort of more kind of in the organization sphere language for people who study organization logistics. It's helpful that you know these terms, because oftentimes, especially if you again, are looking at internships or industry, you might see in job listings or in the future, jobs requiring that you are familiar with Agile or Scrum. So this is why I wanted to introduce these terms to you. But the terms really are just terms. So we'll go through the process and you'll have experience setting up a board and actually doing Scrum and doing the Agile process. So, then it'll become much clearer. Right now, these terms might seem rather obscure and rather not understandable. So this link is also pasted in your guide doc. And actually, I will paste the link to the guide doc for everyone here right now so you can follow along, because we're going to break out soon into groups and go through the Agile process. But I wanted to, give you some links of companies and industries discussing Agile, so you can really get a sense for how real companies think about project management, and we're going to have a practice with Trello specifically. So any questions so far? There's a lot of detailed steps in the doc, which is why I've shared it with everyone. I'll go through it briefly right now with a live demo, but we will then break out into groups, and you can try making tasks, both a Gantt chart and also Trello with everyone. Cool. Okay, so let's move on. So a few task management tips and tricks. This is outside of just kind of the preordained Agile and Scrum methodologies. So like I said, a lot of these tools, take advantage of these tools, even if you realize it might not work for one project or another. I highly suggest you check out Trello, and we will do that when we break out into breakout rooms today. It is very popular, so that's number one, right? Computational identity. Real engineers, like I mentioned, project managers, companies use Trello and or Jira. Those are two of the most popular project management tools out there used today. So it really behooves you to understand and play around with it now. It'll really set you up so that you understand the processes that engineers go through to manage their tasks. And there's 2 templates that are preset on Trello that I find really useful, and we'll take a look in the demo. The project management template is generally, you can use that more for your project overall and list more broader tasks. So for instance, for the create-a-thon, that might include doing your pitch at the end, or how you present your project, right? At the end, that would be another task to add in. That's not really a technical task, but that is something that you still need to do for the create-a-thon, and would be good to keep track of. The Kanban board is a type of commonly used software management tracking. So it's a bit more specific for coding, and it's helpful because it gives you some categories like code review and being blocked, or in development, which are common categories for when you're coding. You might switch in between. Testing is another common category for coding. Separately from task management and Trello and Agile in particular, you might be finding that you might be having trouble scheduling with your team. Scheduling, I suggest you look at when to meet. So just like whentomeet.com, there's a link to it in your guide doc too. It's a pretty visual, simple tool to schedule. Because every person just kind of highlights the availability that they're free. You can go back and edit it to be up to date. And then you can find the times that works for everyone. So this is just a little tip and trick if you're finding it challenging to communicate through Slack or other means of messaging to find a time that works for everyone if you need to get together and work with your team. A lot of times when people schedule in companies, they use similar tools like When to Meet or Calendly, or they share their calendars with each other. So you always, can easily find free time to meet up. I know it seems a little bit obvious, but actually this sort of stuff really can waste a lot of time and add up quickly when you're working with bigger and bigger teams and more people. So this type of like organization skills is actually really helpful for industry, and people really think a lot about time management and how to get that down to be very efficient. So I would definitely suggest you thinking about it for your project, because it could also save time for you and you can focus on your project itself. Finally, for documentation. So documentation is a big thing in most projects, because you might have heard about commenting your code, right? It's a similar idea. Documentation is really important because you leave for the future generation or for yourself in the future to refer back to what you did. And documentation is also really helpful as you're going along, so you don't have everything at the end of a project to do, but instead you've been documenting in chunks every day or every week what's updated about your project, what decisions you've made. I know Tanya and Lauren shared a really useful kind of long, not one pager, like long document that's all in one document and goes through the entire process and gives you sections to document. So I greatly suggest you take advantage of that and document decisions, designs, etc. Follow the template in the document. You can also, of course, feel free to use, just Google Docs or Google Sheets. Oftentimes, these tools that you're probably using for class are great for technical projects too. And certainly at Google, we use Google Drive and Google Docs for documentation and shared docs and slides with everyone. So, that's definitely very useful for the projects that I was a part of. Cool. Okay, link for the doc. Yes, so let me share the doc that was just mentioned. Are there any other questions? Sorry, Lauren, would you mind sharing the link in the chat here? I can't seem to open Slack up for some reason. That would be really helpful. Thank you. Cool. Okay, so let's do a quick check-in. This was some new information. Hopefully this is pretty self-explanatory / understandable. Okay, awesome. Cool. So it looks like most people feel good about this, which is for those of you who want to slow down a little bit, hopefully this will help you. So I'm gonna go through the example with Trello and setting up a project management and Kanban board. So you can take a look as I do the demo. Hopefully this will help you, and then you will break out into teams and start writing up your own tasks. So I'm not going to be writing real tasks here as we go through, but you will with your own teams on what you need to accomplish. Cool. So that's a great question. Do we all need accounts or just one person in the group? So as you go through the Trello onboarding site, the first thing you're going to see is sign up for a free account and invite your teammates. So I would definitely suggest to answer the question, you all do need accounts. When you invite your teammates, they're going to set up a Trello account and be invited to your workspace. What you want to do though is to make sure you have one workspace that everyone is sharing. So if you've already set a team lead, I would definitely encourage the team lead to maybe set the workspace. If you haven't yet, don't worry. Once you get into your breakout rooms in a little bit, you can figure out who should start and set the workspace. It doesn't really make much of a difference otherwise, because everyone will be on the same workspace, and you can also invite people later. You can also set your own workspace, but then, decide after you all set up your accounts, which one is going to be your project workspace. So it's not a big deal, but definitely make sure you're all working in the same workspace, because that way you can share tasks, or you can make task cards and actually see what everyone's doing. Okay, cool. So yeah, so I see no more questions in the chat. So this is going through the Trello onboarding process. It should be pretty self-explanatory. Trello does a really good job of walking you through onboarding. Make sure you select the option of adding a board to your workspace, and then after that, you can start creating your boards. So some terms here, I will review these terms as we watch my live. It's not super exciting of a demo, but we will look at my webpage for Trello. So I already have a Trello account. This is a newer Trello account. So this will look more like, if you create a new Trello account, it will look something like this. You'll see up here, there's templates for project management, for Kanban board, for simple project board. So if you click on the template for project management, it will preload for you. Okay, there we go. So it will preload for you a lot of basically the categories that are going to be helpful to you. You can definitely change these categories, and make sure you notice it says, this is a public template for anyone on the internet to copy. So you create a board from the template. In other words, you copy it. And you can name it anything you want. If you have a project name already, this would be a good time to list your project name, and you can say, your project name, project management, or just your project name board. So I've already created one, so I will move to the one I already created. And let's open this up. So the categories that I want to highlight to you that are pretty interesting on this board is a to-do. That's pretty self-explanatory. Project resources is kind of interesting, because if you have your documents, etc., for stakeholders that you talked about yesterday, or for surveys, you can keep a link of project resources here, since you're already using Trello for task management. So that's a nice repository for keeping a lot of the resources that you've been using in your team, so everyone has easy access to that. If you're using Google Drive, that also definitely works too. This is just another way for you to easily access. And then I want to talk about blocked. So blocked is a really important section in project management and in the Agile methodology, because it helps you understand at a glance anything that can't move forward, right? So any items here, and as you're creating a card and working on your card, it's up to you to be sure to update in this board what is blocked, what is happening, or what you're currently working on, what is not being worked on but in the backlog. Because as you update your cards, you will immediately inform all your team members about the status of your project and your task, right? So this basically prevaricates, or this excludes the need for you to be always messaging on Slack or messaging each other, like asking what's the status of what. So I'll go through now and add a card. I'm going to show you the Kanban board, which is a bit more for each coding task. So notice, I think I added, so I added some example cards here with, for instance, in the backlog, make homepage menu. So the backlog is another category that I want to address that is really helpful. So the backlog means everything that needs to be done, right? So today in your breakout rooms, when you get started and start making tasks with your team, everything should go in the backlog first, because that's where a task should go at first when you're making a card. And you'll make a card for each task. So I just clicked on add a card, and I'm going to say, my previous example was make homepage menu. Maybe here I'll say create chat button. Okay, so then when I've created a card, I'll come in here and add some details. And notice I made it in the backlog because it's, I haven't done this yet. This is going to be a to-do. It's going to be in the backlog. And this is just an easy kind of default way to keep track of tasks. But of course, as I start working on it, I'm going to move it into the accurate section. So you can see there's a lot of options here. You don't have to fill out everything, because one key meta point about organization is make it work for you, right? If you're spending too much time organizing it, then the organization tool isn't as helpful for you as it should be, right? So there's a sweet spot where the tool is giving you a ton of information, it's easy to use it, and you're not, spending more time organizing than is actually worth. So one thing that I like to point out here is the key parts of this task. Think about it this way, right? What are the important things that you need to convey to your team member and to yourself in the future about this task? So usually if you're coding in GitHub, you can add a link to your repo here. If you're not coding in GitHub, or if you're, whatever, coding in App Inventor, that's totally fine. It might not be relevant for you. I would add a little bit of the feature summary here, just so you and also your team members know what it is. But again, you don't need to spend an overly long time on this. This is really just the key highlights to keep you to give you information about what this task is. And you can add feature details if you want, but I would say this is potentially optional. Make sure that you're adding enough detail that it's helpful, but again, not wasting time adding to this Trello board. So you can search for members. And again, when you invite your team members into the board, they'll show up here as members. So in Jira, usually we end up assigning a member as the person who does the task. So the person writing out this card is not necessarily has to be the person doing the task. For Trello and for Create-a-thon, I suggest if you want to, you can definitely always make the card for the task that you're doing. That's just usually ends up being kind of easier. But if you don't, you can easily select a color here for each person. That's actually how I started doing this Trello board. So then you can label the card with the person who is supposed to be doing the task. Does that make sense? So labels is a cool thing to do. Dates is another relatively interesting thing to add if you know there's a due date to a task. If there really isn't, you don't have to necessarily add it because it might not be useful for you and your team. And then watching the task means that you'll get notifications every time this card is moved. So if you really, if you don't own a task and you want to make sure you're being notified about someone else's task, this is another useful tool to have. So then once I start, implementing, I can move it to, it's to do, or I'm doing it. I could also move it to design. You don't have to move a task every time you do something if it's a really short, period of doing a task. But I definitely recommend, especially since this is a 2-week Create-a-thon, that you do a quick check of the Trello board in the morning and in the evening for each day, so that you can update all of your tasks, and therefore by updating all of your tasks, be really thoughtful and mindful of your team members, so that that when they look at the Trello board, all the tasks will be updated. Cool. Does that make sense to most folks? I added a blocked section to the Kanban board also because you can get more specific about if each specific coding task is being blocked by someone else or just blocked in general. You guys can check in and really talk about the urgent blocked issues. This is a great way to kind of pull out the tasks that need to be urgently discussed when you meet with your team, and you can kind of surf over. You don't have to like discuss all the things that are going well, and you don't necessarily need to spend a lot of time meeting on. Cool. Any questions before we jump in and you can start doing this with your team?
Yeah, I have one quick question, but it was from a while ago. But I was just curious. When you first started presenting, you had something called an RFC doc. I just wanted to clarify what that was.
Yeah, of course. Yes, so let me reshare. That's a great question. So RFC in industry stands for request for comments. It's typically a very common way that engineers write design docs. It's just a name. Different companies might call these docs different things. They might just be called implementation doc. But it's a way, let me jump back to that slide. But sorry, back. Yeah, it's a way to write your implementation details. Apologies, my computer is spazzing out a little bit. Okay, I'll stop sharing for now. So I wrote in the guide doc some of the key components of an implementation doc. It's very broad because it really depends on the technical details of where you're implementing, but in general, you want to have a summary and then go into detail for each section. So if you're making backend architecture, which may or may not be relevant for teams here, you would have a section on backend and architecture. If you're making front end, you would have a section on front end. If you're doing in a deep learning track, and if you're retraining a model, or getting a data set and then training your own model, etc., you would have like a section on the model architecture and the algorithms you're using, etc. So it's very tailored to whatever technical stuff you're doing. But it's called request for comments because generally what engineers do is they need feedback on the design that they're proposing, right? So then they can share it with other engineering and product people, et cetera, for other folks to give comments on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Cool. It's a bit more like heavy-handed probably than is necessary for your project for the create-a-thon, but I wanted to show this because it definitely is what engineers do in industry. And if you might find that type of doc template helpful for you, even as you are doing the create-a-thon, just because, okay, so I think I'm getting my computer back. Just because it could be a very helpful way for you to go through and with your team figure out the technical details of what you want to implement. Cool. All right, so I will open up breakout rooms, and please go through. The steps are a little bit, I think, probably easier to read if you look through the doc, and the steps are under how to manage your projects with Trello, and all the steps are 1, 2, 3, 4 numbered down, both starting out with Trello and onboarding. You can also reference the slides, of course, and then also what we just did together, how to write each task card. So I think by the end of the breakout session, each person, you should hopefully have created an account each one and be on a shared workspace, and then started creating cards for yourself that you have to complete in your team. If you haven't discussed how to split up tasks, this is also a great time to do that. You can work with your mentor too to discuss how to split up different types of tasks, both coding tasks and also business pitch and other things that we talked about at the beginning. And also let me know if you have any questions on that. Cool. All right, so I will open up breakout rooms. And the rooms are all of your team members again. So happy task listing and Trelloing, and I'll walk around, or I'll drop in and out to see how everyone's doing, answer any questions.